was a normal morning at Lincoln High School. Students laughing in the hallways, teachers prepping for their first classes, the hum of everyday school life. But at 10:17 a.m., everything changed. A suspicious individual walked into the building, no ID, no appointment, no questions asked. They roamed the hallways for nearly 15 minutes before a teacher, noticing something wasn't right, alerted the office. By the time the school security intervened, the individual had already entered the classroom. Thankfully, the situation didn't escalate. This wasn't a headline making event, it wasn't breaking news story. It was just another day in a school that, like many others, assumed it won't happen here. The reality is, school security is not just about reacting to the worst case scenario, it's about preventing it in the first place. And that's why today's episode is so important. I want to welcome you all back to another episode of Let's Talk Solutions. I'm your host, Hunter Pettis, and as always, I'm glad that you're here with us today. If you haven't already, please follow us and subscribe so you get notified when new episodes are released. Today, we're diving into school safety with one of the leading experts in the field. With the rise of safety concerns in schools, it's never been more critical to take proactive measures to protect students and staff. Joining me today is Paul Timm, a nationally recognized school security specialist, a board-certified physical security professional, and an author of School Security: How to Build and Strengthen a School Safety Program. He's worked with schools across the country to assess vulnerabilities, implement strong safety measures, and create environments where students and staff feel secure without feeling like they're in a fortress. Paul, thank you for being here and welcome to the show.
Hunter, thank you for having me on the show. I'm really glad to be here.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. I've heard so many great things. I've seen you in presentations in the past with our risk management conferences. So it's a pleasure to actually sit down and have a conversation with you. As I've already mentioned some of your background, I'm a little bit more curious about how you got into school safety and where you are currently.
Well, thanks for mentioning my background. I grew up in the Chicago area in a day when my dad worked at Argonne National Labs, which is a Department of Energy facility. And he kind of built a career around an engineer view of physical security. And in 1984, after 15 years there, they asked him to start his own consulting firm so he could help out all the DOE facilities nationwide. I joined that firm in the late 90s, and so I'm very much a second generation physical security consultant.
Wow. Keeping it in the family business. Paul, as I was thinking about this episode, I reminisced a little bit about my own school matriculation. And in the fall of 2002, in the DC area, there was the DC sniper. And there was an immense amount of school safety and security that had to take place to ensure that no students or staff were affected by what was going on during that time. Needless to say, school safety has always been a concern, but in recent years, the conversation has definitely intensified. So I'd like to start off our conversation and set the foundation by asking, where do schools stand today in terms of school safety?
Well, they're safer. And they're safer because when you went to school and in the years before that, when I went to school, things were far more open, far more relaxed, less practices involving visitor management and the locking of doors and systems that were in place. And so we've gotten better over time. Even with awareness, we've gotten better. And unfortunately, some of that awareness is driven by fear, which we don't want at all, but a heightened sense of awareness is good. So schools in general are safer. However, risks are greater. And we can think about the isolation of the individual. We can think about social media. We can think about societal, the climate, political climate. We can think about all of these things, but there's no doubt that the risk is higher than it used to be in places where, in general, we're safer than we would have been.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is a little bit frightening to see some of the things, whether it's in the mainstream media or even on social media, the things that are happening in our schools. Here at ARM, a lot of the times we have those conversations where churches and schools, especially in our little bubble, if you will, we operate under the assumption that they're inherently safe environments, or at least as I had kind of mentioned in my fictitious story, that it will never happen here. But as we try to build a good foundation, you alluded to some of these things already, but what are some of the characteristics that should be present in a school to actually be considered high level of safe?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for the Ministry of ARM. I admire what you're doing. And I want to say it begins with relationships. Now, I'm a physical security guy, and people would say, well, aren't you going to talk about cameras and weapons detection? And maybe we'll talk about some of that later, but it begins with relationships. In general, people don't harm or wish to harm people who they know care about them. And that should be a hallmark of the churches and schools anyway, is that we're in a place that's supportive and a place that's caring and a place that offers resources. As I think back to my high school days, I think probably about, I don't know, 80, 90% of the teachers I had were good teachers. And maybe a very small percentage of them were not great because they had mailed it in or they didn't like kids anymore or whatever. But also a small percentage of those teachers I knew for some reason really invested in me. And I don't know why that is, personalities, whatever. But I think we can never go wrong when we're investing. We can't do that perfectly with every single student, every single staff member, but we sure can try to be ambassadors of God's love.
Absolutely. Well said. Absolutely. Ambassadors of of love. One thing that we preach, and I'm sure you've heard it on multiple occasions, is we talk about child protection a lot here. And we often speak in terms of building the right fence in regards to securing, so you wouldn't talk about cameras and things of that nature just as much, because I mean that social aspect is definitely important and probably most pivotal. So maybe so much as the physical things, the physical measures that we can actually set in place, but could you, I guess, more so describe maybe the security planning team and the relationship between schools, parents, and the community?
Yes, thank you. I want to touch on both of those things because they are connected. But first of all, a collaborative approach is always the best approach. Nobody has shoulders broad enough to carry the whole security program by themselves. And unfortunately, we occasionally bring in people who are former military, former law enforcement, and thank you for your service. I'm going to make a generalization, but sometimes that person thinks that they're going to power up and carry everything by themselves. It doesn't work. And so we've got to make sure that we've got staff that are making a personal investment in the safety of the school. Administrators, students, parents, community making a personal investment. And that begins with a safety planning team. And the safety planning team has internal stakeholders, like I just mentioned, and external stakeholders, which would include our emergency responders. Listen, we know why we're here on this earth, and making sure that we're connecting with community is at the forefront of that. Now, once we've got that in place, we are going to make sure that we've got a layered approach to security. We're going to start with the property, and if we can't fence every property, we have urban settings and suburban and rural. I understand that, but we're going to look at the property to make sure it's secure. We're going to look at the parking area to make sure it's secure. We're going to look at the building and the building envelope to make sure it's secure. And then inside classrooms and interior spaces, we want to make sure. So we've got layered security all the way to where the most important asset is inside.
I like that. I like that. That layered security makes a ton of sense to me. So I see the building blocks here. We're building from community. We're setting the layers in place for the security in and of itself. One thing that really, as I'm having these conversations, you and I are having this conversation. Our listeners tend to be the leaders in their individual churches. Even when we're at risk our RMC conference, there it's a lot of the leadership level of the ones that are having these conversations. But one thing that I'm interested in, and maybe you can speak on, is how can we have a healthy and appropriate involvement of the students?
Well, I always like to say this first to leaders: set an example. And that's really what we should be doing with leadership anyway. If we're required to wear ID badges, wear them. If we're required to go through visitor management procedures, go through them. I remember I've got 4 kids who are now adults, but my daughter wrote an essay in high school and she said, Dad, I have to do a persuasive essay and I have 2 points. Can you help me find a third point? I need three. And I said, what's the topic? And she said, why students shouldn't have to wear IDs at XYZ school. And I said, well, I don't agree with you, so I'm not helping. No, I didn't say that. I said, well, what are the points that you have? And she said, number one, why do students definitely have to wear badges if not all of the teachers are wearing them? And why, her second one was, why is wearing a badge so important when people are propping open exterior doors anyway? And it's, we understand why a student looks at things and says, hold on, if you're not holding the line, why do I have to hold the line? And so it's important to hold the line. Second of all, student involvement is important because the students are seeing everything. They're ahead of us in technology. And when I say us, I say loosely, Hunter, because I know you're ahead of me in technology, but it's just the way it cascades down. The student who's at a middle school level today is ahead of all of us in technology. It's just the way it is. And students generally have a much better pulse for what's really going on. So we must find appropriate ways to involve them. And one would be in the safety planning team. And one might be, hey, I don't know much about Snapchat. So why don't we have a student come and talk with us about Snapchat and how it works? We might learn something. We might be able to build a bridge, and we might be helping that student become a leader anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I've heard a plethora of the tech genius at the school at the student level who's able to get backdoor access to some physical securities that we don't always take into consideration. Even ways to get into the building that we think it's secure, no one can get into it, and the students always find a way. I laugh actually when you talk about your daughter writing the persuasive argument about why the students should wear lanyards, because I was that rebellious high school kid that refused to wear my lanyard, so much so I got detention behind it. But that's
I can hardly believe that, Hunter.
I understand the reasons why now, but as a student, you're thinking on kind of. I didn't want to start the conversation off with this, but at the same time, I know that it's important for us to mention. We don't have to go in full detail, but as we all know, there was an incident at one of our schools. It could have been worse. It's still not great, and I would actually like to touch on I've spent some time in conversation with professionals at the FBI level, some that do the ALICE training. But where do we begin the conversation and what advice do we give to teachers and school admin in response to active shooters?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. And I'm going to just say it. I'll start this way. First of all, we don't give in to fear. And, that's not having lordship over my life, over your life, over our lives. We're not doing that. We understand that God is our refuge. And so that's very important. And that doesn't mean we put it on autopilot. We're still responsible for the stewardship. We put watchers on the wall. It's very clear in scripture that we have a right to play. We're not our own refuge, but we are going to take responsibility in places that we can. And second of all, I think what we do is we say it's still a very, very rare occurrence that something like this happens. And by the way, that doesn't mean it's okay. My heart breaks for people who've gone through the trauma in that incident that you're mentioning, in all of these incidents. And some of the survivors of these incidents are some of my very best friends, many of them people of faith, and trying to bring redemptive components now to lessons learned. And those lessons learned are almost always this. We were we were sort of taking everything easy. We weren't being vigilant. And by the way, I'm not applying that to any particular incident because every incident is different. But
Absolutely.
in the aftermath, we almost always say, ooh, I wish we would have. And so, what can we do with our safety planning team? We can bring them ahead of any incident and we can say, what are some of our concerns? What are some of our risks? How can we build the wall? And when I say the wall, I'm not talking about a real one. I'm not talking about saying we're going to be Fort Knox. But what I am saying is this: what are our concerns? How can we how can we be better with behavioral threat assessment? How can we be better with our community who wants to visit? And we do want them to visit, but we want them to visit with authority present. And how do we place these things? And I want to say this: it feels daunting, but so much of this work has been done by others. And there are groups like Safe and Sound Schools that grew out of the aftermath of the Sandy Hook incident. There are other non-for-profit groups like the Partner Alliance for Safer Schools. They've tried to put a lot of these things in place so you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Aside from active shooter, I know it's been standardized for, I don't know when it became a thing, but you already have your fire drills as standard at most schools. Active shooter, there's some schools that kind of have drills. There's some that are still on the fence about that for various reasons. But what are some other school emergencies that you would recommend schools and planning around the need for that?
Yeah. Well, I'm thankful, first of all, that you brought out fire because I was pretty much raised in Chicago and have lived there most of my life. And that's where 67 years ago, Our Lady of the Angels Catholic School burned to the ground and almost 100 people died. And after that, agencies and entities got together and said, we can never let this happen in a school again. Schools have to have fire alarm systems and fire extinguishers and be made of fire retardant materials and conduct fire drills. And you did those and I did those. And maybe we didn't love doing them. We got prepared while doing them. And because we put those practices and those codes in place, there hasn't been one student who has died in a school related fire since. And Hunter, there are about 3,000 fires in educational institutions every calendar year. There's been burns, there's been severe injuries and smoke inhalation, but no deaths. So, how can we take that and apply it to the security and an active shooter kind of threat arena? There are many entities trying to do that. One of them is ASIS International. They are going to this year come out with their standards for school security. And anybody who's listening, it's a good thing to just keep your ear open for those standards. They're going to be basics. And you say, well, having locks on doors and having, you know, basic video surveillance systems, all that's very basic. But yes, many schools are missing components or schools have walkie talkies instead of two-way radios. And I don't want to break down all of the differences here, but there should be some basic standards that are in place, and those are about to be unveiled. And second of all, I think, like I said, the safety planning team gets together and says, where are our gaps and where are our vulnerabilities? How can we address them in a prioritized way? And I know I'm going on a little bit here, but I know it a lot of times it comes back to money. We don't have the funds. We're not like a public school. We're not, and the grants are not available for us. And first of all, that's not always true. Grants may be available. There's a great site for that. It's called schoolsafety.gov, which is a government site but has private foundations and grants that can help schools and churches. But second of all, it's not always just throwing money at it. It's making sure that we have brought the right kind of instruction and held people accountable so that they can make a personal investment. And when my eyes are part of see something, say something, or see something, do something, when that happens, we build a culture that's safer. And that's really what I espouse is building a safe culture.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and I think that's what I'm hearing, and it sounds crucial to have that safe culture, the community behind it. I know I had mentioned how I went to school in DC, and was in grade school during the DC sniper. Later on in life, I went to a school where there was tornadoes. Growing up in DC, I wasn't familiar. I know that tornadoes exist, but I wasn't in a state where it was prominent. And the first time I experienced a tornado warning, Paul, was in the middle of the night, and I thought the Lord was coming. I kid you not, the sirens going off, and I just had no idea. that experience really stood out in my mind as to, why did no one warn me? What am I supposed to do? I have no idea. You've kind of already talked about how to involve the students and have the community a part of those things, but I think that's a key aspect that sometimes gets overlooked.
Well, I want to thank you for circling back because I didn't fully answer that last question. You said, what other kinds of emergencies are we preparing for? And of course, far more likely to occur than a violence emergency would be a medical emergency and a severe weather emergency, which you're referring to right now. And we've got to be a little bit better with, I know codes require us to have automatic external defibrillators, but where are they? And who can use them? And does it require me being certified in first aid, CPR, and AED to be able to utilize that? And by the way, the answer is no. It gives simple audio instructions. Don't look at an AED on a wall if somebody needs assistance if you're not certified and say, well, I wish I could have helped them. No, it's going to walk you through how to do that. We now are storing trauma kits and stop the bleed kits. And in terms of severe weather, not only tornadoes, but the great shakeout is a practice we do for earthquakes, and coastal regions may have hurricanes. So, I'm in a place right now where we've got a severe winter storm, and ice can be a problem and flooding is an issue. How do we deal with all of those things? And it's always a multi-hazard approach. I want to share one more resource on that right now. There's another non for profit called the I Love You Guys Foundation, and they make what's called SRP, Standard Response Protocol. They make these kinds of procedures available for free to schools.
That sounds like some excellent resources, and I appreciate you sharing that with our listeners. I think that they'll also appreciate that as well. The other thing that I think we've kind of discussed it. So we've definitely laid the foundation of some of the things that our listeners should take into account when they're building the right fence, if you will, or building the wall, however you want to look at it, the layered approach of protecting these schools, having community involved. We've talked about how to involve the teachers and staff, as well as how to have a healthy and appropriate involvement of the students. But how do we what role can parents play in school security and safety efforts?
Yes. Well, first of all, it should be a supportive role. And that doesn't mean that as a parent, I might agree with everything that the school is doing, but working against the score would be bad for everybody. So, how can I, as a parent, be more engaged? And I like to bring at least a parent or two representatives into the safety planning team, Hunter, because sometimes as a parent, I may have an agenda. If we just were wearing school uniforms, we'd be safe. Or if we just had weapons detection systems, we'd be safer. But what I don't often get to see is the whole view, the comprehensive view. And when we're bringing parents and we're transparent with what we're doing, all of a sudden the information begins, I think, to backfill the concerns that I had. So I'm very much for including parents in that way. And as a parent, I'm very much for going to the school to say, hey, please tell me what you have in place. In fact, when my students made the my kids made the transition as students from high school to college, I went with them on the college visits and I asked to speak with the public safety person to say, what is it that you have on this campus? And you know what I found? Very forthcoming, very intentional about the measures they had in place. And as a parent, I should be wanting to know what that is and giving them an opportunity to share.
Yeah, I think that's excellent approach to that, and it would be nice. I think like you said, you'll have more people that are open and welcome to having that conversation to ensure that the security is in place. You know, so I like this. I really appreciate this. I really can say that I've learned a lot from this conversation. And before we kind of begin to wrap things up, I just wanted to kind of open the floor a little bit more for you and see if there's anything that we may have missed or haven't discussed just yet that you would kind of encourage our listeners more on when it comes to school security.
Thank you for asking. I appreciate you leaving room for that. I always tell administrators this: if you only have $1 to spend and you only have an hour to plan, and it sounds like your budget and your schedule, right? Then you want to focus on the two areas that protect people the most. Now, I grew up at Argonne National Labs, and there were high fences around the whole property, razor wire at the top of those fences, and there were people at the gates who had, their finger on the triggers of long guns, and they had layers of intrusion detection systems, or what you would call burglar alarm systems, because their number one asset was uranium and plutonium supplies. We needed to detect the bad guy before they got to the center of the campus. Now, many schools have burglar alarm systems, and I think that's great. But the burglar alarm system is not protecting people, it's
Uh,
protecting things. But in
uh-huh.
the school arena, people are more important than things. I think we all would agree. And the two areas that always protect people the most when we're talking about physical security are communication systems and devices. We have got to be able to get help. And I don't know if you're familiar with legislation that's sweeping the country now, but it's called Alyssa's Law. And it comes out of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas incident. And basically it says, can I, as a student or a staff member, always be able to get to a button or a device that allows me to connect with responders if there's an emergency? Can we do that in house? Is there a telephone? Is there an intercom call button? Is there a two-way radio? So communication is always very important. I need to be able to get help, and I need to get a message if an emergency notification has been issued. And then the second area, if I only have $1 to spend and an hour to plan, is access control. And that's why I talked a little bit about the layered approach. Do we know when somebody's on our property? Do we know when they've entered the parking lot? Do we decide how they come into the building? And once they're in, where they go? Access control, not very easy, but we have to be able to restrict it so that the people who are not permitted in certain areas don't get there, and the people who are able to. And so those two, communications and access control, very, very important.
Absolutely. I like to throw you a little bit of a maybe it'll be a curveball, maybe not. Maybe you're Babe Ruth to stick with that analogy, but it stands out specifically for me because I spent some time as an account executive and I took some of the knowledge that I had, what little bit of knowledge I had at the time to speak about school security. And while I was present, it turns out that as a go figure, one size doesn't fit all. And it's a lot of the individuals that were in that room and that were present are actually the entire staff. The one teacher, the one person is the principal, is the teacher for all the students, is the art teacher, you go down the list, they are that one person at that school. Are there things that the one teacher, small school can do to also be prepared? Is there any differences there, or is it kind of all a little bit of the same?
Yeah, I totally understand that because in many, especially our smaller schools, that individual is the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. I went to a parochial school, and in seventh grade, our teacher was also the principal of the school. And when I say teacher, he taught all subjects to both seventh and eighth grade. We were all together in one room. And not only seventh and eighth grade, but he had advanced math and English for seventh and advanced math and English for eighth. That man was carrying a full load. And what we do in that case, we remind that person, as capable as they are, that it takes a collaborative approach. How can we get help from others? There are other teachers in the school. There are custodians in the school. There are pastors from the local church. There are parents who are helping. My mom was a lunch mom. There are people we can delegate things to, who we can count on for certain things. And so I remind that person, your shoulders aren't broad enough to do this by yourself. You need help. Let people help.
Like that. I like that. And hopefully that is helpful to those individuals in that situation because when I had that conversation, it quickly became exhausting for me, not in a bad way, but just I felt like I didn't have the answers for them, and so I hope that begins to get the gears churning and provide them with a bit of a response. So I want to thank you, Paul. Thank you for that. Um, as that being said, we're getting towards the end of this episode. I definitely want to send my warmest thanks for Paul for you being with us today and Thank you, everyone else who has joined us. If you found this conversation meaningful, please share it with others who might benefit. If you're interested in diving deeper, I would recommend Paul's book, shameless plug there.
Thank you.
Again, it's School Security: How to Build and Strengthen a School Safety Program. It's a must read. I'd also like to take an opportunity for you to share your platform, Paul. Where can people connect with you and learn more about your work?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the shout out for the book. It's again, my mom loves the book, and so I think you will too. But I want to say this: I also have a podcast. It's called "The Changing Face of School Security," and we bring in a guest in a 30-minute podcast who has a certain amount of expertise, but also resources to be able to share. And just like I shared a few websites here today, and I strongly recommend that you look at the I Love You Guys Foundation, safeandsoundschools.org, schoolsafety.gov, and passk12.org. I think all of those non-for-profits are going to be of use to you. But if you're interested, especially in school security, the podcast will be helpful. And Hunter, I don't have the smooth tones that you do. And so great facilitation of this podcast. In no way are we competing with that at all. But if somebody wants to drill down, that would be the place to go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I actually have listened. I haven't listened to every episode, but I have listened to a few of your episodes of your podcast, and I highly recommend it as well. So thanks for sharing that. And I want to thank you again, Paul, for you sharing your expertise with us today. Again, for our listeners, if you found this episode valuable, please share, subscribe, and leave us a review. You can share this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music. We also have a new podcast page on our website. Simply go over to adventistrisk.org, hover over the Safety Resources tab, and then select Let's Talk Solutions Podcast. Here you can listen to all our episodes and share certain episodes or the entire page. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our solutions newsletter to receive even more safety and risk management resources for your church, school, or ministry. As always, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And until next time, stay faithful and stay prepared. God bless.